O Lord, how long shall I cry for help? Will you not hear? Will you not save? The wicked surround the righteous. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, yet I will rejoice in the Lord God. The Lord is my strength.
Well, hey everyone, turn to Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 5. You'll find Habakkuk in your paper Bible around all those other books that sound like Star Wars characters. Obadiah, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Micah, Chewbacca, Habakkuk. So it's right in there near the New Testament, short little book that tells us how to face evil times. And so whether they're your own individual evil times, because we all go through them, or society-wide evil times, we're listening in on a series of complaints by Habakkuk and responses by God. And today, God responds to the second complaint of Habakkuk by appealing to both our minds and our hearts. And sometimes we think we have to choose between head and heart because all of us have natural leanings. And so the head people walk into a crisis with a whiteboard and a 3-point plan. The heart people walk into the same crisis and start crying and hugging everyone. And head people want to fix it, and heart people want to feel it. And head people think that heart people are being dramatic, and heart people think that head people are robots. And I think God addresses both. Because when you're facing prolonged evil or injustice in a society, you can't just think your way through it, and you can't just feel your way through it. You need both mental clarity about what you're actually up against, and you need emotional endurance so that you don't break. Otherwise, it's easy to let our minds go into full outrage mode. Like you can't stop thinking about all the things that are wrong and all the injustices, and it masquerades as mental clarity, and so you just give way to full-blown outrage, and we see this happening a lot. And the other alternative, it seems, is to let our hearts descend into indifference. And this masquerades as emotional health, but indifference isn't peace, it's numbness. You just stop caring. And these are corrupted responses of what really should be going on in our minds and our hearts when the days are evil. You see, both perpetual outrage and passive indifference are considered acceptable responses in our society to what's going on in the world, but neither are an option for Christians, because both will slowly lead to destruction. Outrage is mind without heart, and indifference is heart without mind. And God wants to give us both in this passage together, rightly ordered. And so in Habakkuk chapter 2, I believe God gives us a path forward in seasons of prolonged evil or injustice. And so we pick up our story with our frustrated prophet. He's in his waiting watchtower. He's eager for God's response. And last week ended with this famous verse, Pastor Sarah told us, where God says that the righteous shall live by faith. And as we begin today, we're going to see the opposite. What happens to those who don't live by faith? We find that God will deal justly with both the righteous and the unrighteous. In fact, even when it looks like the enemy, Chaldeans or the Babylonians, are winning, God is planning the course of his justice. Now, I need to say one more thing as we dive into our text today in Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 5. And I'll say it this way. I don't want you to miss the snarkiness of this text, okay? A lot of times we come to the Bible and we think we need to turn off our propensity towards satire or sarcasm and get very serious. But today, like a good portion of today's text, is a form of an ancient literary genre that's called taunt poetry. So these were mocking poems and mocking songs that were written to make fun of fallen foes. This is the forerunner to smack talking and taunting. NFL referees would surely call a 15-yard penalty on God after this outburst. This is God speaking, and it's satirical. It's biting. It forms a mocking song that all the oppressed people are going to sing over their oppressor, Babylon, once it has fallen. And so these are very serious warnings, but they're written with a hint of snark, okay? So remember, in verse 4, we just said, God said, the righteous live by faith. And here we are in verse 5, we get the contrast. Moreover, wine is a traitor, an arrogant man who is never at rest. His greed is as wide as Sheol. Like death, he has never enough. He gathers for himself all nations and collects as his own all peoples. Shall not all these take up their taunt against him with scoffing and riddles for him. Now, I want to stop and just explain a couple of things before we get into the 5 woes that God issues. And so in verse 5, he begins with, wine is a traitor. That this isn't primarily a reference to like alcohol, wine. This is a metaphor describing how building empires with power is almost intoxicating. It'll eventually catch up with those who pursue the constant quest for acquiring and conquering others. God calls it greed here. Now, Babylon never has enough. They're gathering nations, they're collecting people. But then if you notice in verse 6, we have this taunting section that begins. And he says, all these will take up their taunts. In other words, all the people in the nations that the evil Babylon has plundered will one day speak these taunts against them. They will trash talk over their proverbial grave after God brings this empire down in due time. So God has heard the cries of the people. And he has scheduled the retribution for Babylon already. And he's going to pronounce these 5 progressively intensifying woes as if their fate is already sealed. Now listen, these woes are not just descriptive of Babylon. They describe the true consequence of wicked living. And before I go through them, let me just pause and set a framework here. Because what God is really doing in this text is not just condemning Babylon's actions. Like a doctor, he's diagnosing the disease beneath the symptoms. He's showing Habakkuk and us what's actually driving all this evil. And then he's giving us something to hold on to when we're surrounded by it. And that's what we need, isn't it? Evil isn't going away. And so we need to understand what we're actually up against. And then we need something and someone that can steady us when everything feels like it's falling apart. And God gives us both in this passage. God addresses our minds and our hearts. He shows us how to think about the source of the evil. And then he gives us a place to anchor our souls in the face of it. So let's call it how to posture your mind and heart when you're facing evil times. Here's the first way. It's clarity for the mind. Evil is unleashed through pride and idolatry. So God provides bookends of this section to show us the source of this evil. And he talks about this pride in verse 5. And then in verse 19, he ends up with the sin of idolatry. The evil of any society can be traced back to these 2 sins, pride and idolatry. And this is important because if we're not clear on the source of evil, we'll begin to assign blame too broadly or too vaguely. These days, we've oversimplified it to just say, well, evil, that's just the other side. Over there, they're all sources of evil. Just watch how quickly social media scrambles to blame the other side at every breaking news story. There was another shooting, and literally 30 seconds after it happened, one side is posting with absolute certainty that the shooter is another trans activist or whatever, and the other side with equal certainty it was surely a gun-toting MAGA person. Everything that happens in the news is instantly categorized and instantly assigned blame, all the way from hurricanes to judges' rulings to late night comedian monologues to Super Bowl halftime choices. It's like we don't even have a category anymore to evaluate whether something is just smart or dumb. Sometimes people still just do dumb things, you know. But we go instantly to good and evil. That person made a decision I don't like or I disagree with, and we don't even have the capacity to think, well, that was dumb, or I wouldn't have done it that way. We just go immediately to that person is evil. They are a monster. And we rush then to justify and say, see, my side is the good guys, and the other side over there is the evil bad guys. And listen, there's plenty of good and plenty of evil going on for sure. But when we're not truly understanding the source of evil and we rush instantly to demonizing the people around us, it only amplifies our pain. We have to think our way to the truth. We have to use our head to get to the source of evil. And God gives us insight here in the bookends to these 5 woes, the source at the top of all this. In verse 5, he says, he, the Babylonian society, is the he, is an arrogant man who is never at rest because his greed is wide and like death, he is never enough. And so he gathers for himself all nations and collects as his own all peoples. That's the description of pride. What's God doing here? He's describing why is this society postured this way? And it's because of pride. These people are trying to make as much money as possible on the backs of others. Their power has become intoxicating. Like, you want to get to the bottom of why most things are happening in our country today? Follow the money trail and the power trail. Why are riots happening in certain cities? Follow the money trail. Find out who's supplying the protest placards and the pallets of bricks to throw. Why are certain medicines required for everything? Follow the money trail to pharmaceutical companies. Why are certain wars entered or exited? Follow the trail of money and power. Rarely anymore are these things being done for pure ideological reasons. They're being done in the pursuit of money and power. That's the sin of pride. Down in verse 16, he makes reference to the fact that they are trying to cover themselves with glory and honor. Pride, which is at the essence of every human heart, apart from the intervention of God, is the source of all evil in the world. It is the very sin that set Satan himself on his history-long quest to unseat God from his throne. It came back to his desire to achieve equality with God. It's pride. Lewis Smedes says it this way, and please forgive the long quote, but he says, pride, in the religious sense, is an arrogant refusal to let God be God. It is to grab God's status for oneself. Pride is turning down God's invitation to join the dance of life as a creature in his garden and wishing instead to be the creator, independent, reliant on one's own resources. Pride is the grand illusion, the fantasy of fantasies, the cosmic put on. And this fantasy that we can make it as little gods leaves us empty at the center. We are attacked by the demons of fear and anxiety, and so we learn to swagger, to bluff. We force other people to act as buttresses for the shaky ego that pride created by emptying our soul of God. Every new situation calls forth the question, what can I get out of this to support the need of my ego for power and applause? So at the front end of this list of sins is pride. And at the back end, in verses 18 and 19, we'll see, is idolatry. Any life and any creature that is not based on the glory and the grace of God will be based on an idol. God says down in verse 18, as he continues his taunt toward the very end, he says, what profit is an idol when its maker has shaped it, a metal image, a teacher of lies? For its maker trusts in his own creation when he makes speechless idols. Idolatry is this propensity to take something good and raise it to an ultimate, to take something relative and make it an absolute, to try and create something that will give to you and do for you what only God can give to you and do for you. Idolatry creates seeds of destruction in every culture. And in our society today, I can see two paths toward idolatry. One kind of on the right politically and one on the left. And on the right, the path toward idolatry is this thing called nationalism. Now, I want to make a very clear distinction between Christian nationalism and patriotism. Patriotism is great. I think we should all be proud of our country and thankful for our country and to seek the good of our country at all times. But when patriotism bleeds into nationalism, it's when there's this fusing together of faith and country where my belief in God and my belief in my country are almost indistinguishable from each other. Because at the heart of it is I believe that this nation is the only nation, or at least the primary nation, that will be the uniquely chosen instrument of God to accomplish his purposes on earth. Even if that means pulling the levers of governmental power that are reserved for the state to benefit the church, even when it expects that the government is going to advance a particular version of my Christianity. And I will just say this, every single time, 100% of the time through history, when the church has gotten into bed with the state, it ends badly and the church ends up corrupted. Why? Because this kind of thinking is a version of idolatry that God detests. It's taking something that's good, our country, our national identity, and it's making it ultimate. I will remind us that the church is a global, multiracial, multinational enterprise, and it's not beholden to any one country over another. I'm aware of all the conversations that are going on right now around Christian nationalism and all the pastors defending this and saying this about it and that, so you don't have to send me the podcast or the sermon links. I'm just here to tell you that historically, it always goes bad. It always gets corrupted. The other path to idolatry, this one more prominent on the left, is activism, political activism. It's become like a new religion for our time, for the left, complete with ideologies and dogmas and moral lines that you can and can't cross and you can and can't question. Now, I'm not talking about political engagement, which is generally good. I would just warn against putting your ultimate hope or your ultimate identity in that cause of choice, because in many cases, it seems like the policies themselves have become secondary. And what's ultimately important is kind of performing your zeal. Activism has become an almost performative pursuit to demonstrate one's convictions. And it's filled often with contradictions because it's somewhere along the line, the need to resist and to protest has taken precedent over actually solving the problems. And so I've even seen instances recently of activists resisting policies that they would otherwise agree with simply because it's being proposed by the other side. This is a form of idolatry because it's made the cause ultimate, can't be questioned. And so God comes along and he says, you want to see an empire fall? Make sure it's riddled with pride and idolatry. They're a lethal combination. By identifying these two sources of evil, God is helping us to think about evil through a different lens, one that elevates us above the fray of stone throwing and helps us to get our minds around what's actually going on. He then levies these 5 woes. And I just want to walk through them. And as we go into these, just a woe, this word, it isn't just a warning, it's actually a funeral dirge. This is a Hebrew word used commonly at funerals. God is essentially pronouncing Babylon already dead. He's singing their death song before they've actually fallen. So this list describes the typical forms of oppression and injustice that are perpetrated by nations like Babylon, but they aren't unique to Babylon. Given our human condition and our propensity towards sin, most nations will eventually become like Babylon. And so God's answer to Habakkuk becomes God's answer to all later generations and his answer to anyone who lives in a world full of Babylons. Remember, God is addressing Habakkuk's complaint about evil, and he does it by pronouncing judgment on Babylon. And so just let me describe these 5 woes. And these are God's detailed indictments. And listen, in America, it's easy for us to look around the world at North Korea or Iran or whatever and say, well, they must be, what he's talking about here. They must be the modern Babylons. And as we go through this list, it doesn't take long to realize that all nations, including our own nation, have Babylonic tendencies. And a more poignant question for us to ask is to say, how are we like Babylon? And how can we turn back to our great God? So, woe number 1, I would describe it this way: predatory wealth. Look at verse 6. God says, woe to him who heaps up wealth that's not his own. For how long? And he loads himself with pledges. Will not your debtors suddenly arise, and those awake who will make you tremble? Then you will be spoil for them, because you have plundered many nations. All the remnant of the peoples shall plunder you, for the blood of man and the violence to the earth, to cities, and to all who dwell in them. And so he addresses this first woe to those who build wealth through extortion and through the exploitation of others. God promises that those who have plundered and taken advantage of people for their own financial gain will themselves be plundered. They will find themselves becoming victims of the very system that they created. And did you notice in verse 6, he says, how long? For how long is this going to happen? And it's implied, almost this sarcastic response. He's saying, not much longer now. And lo and behold, this Babylonian empire, this very one, would only last about another 100 years before its demise after the death of Nebuchadnezzar. It was already dying, and God's pronouncing its judgment. Look at woe number 2. I would call this building security from corrupt scheming. He says here in verse 9, woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, to set his nest on high, to be safe from the reach of harm. You have devised shame for your house by cutting off many people. You have forfeited your life. For the stone will cry out from the wall, and the beam from the woodwork respond. So God's identifying here another unjust economic practice. Those who think that they can place themselves beyond the reach of the consequences after gaining their wealth through crooked means. So we have here the image of a bird, maybe an eagle, building its nest high on the cliffs to remain untouchable. And it's a reference to Babylon's great building projects. They had many of them, and they would raise high their walls and fortifications while destroying many innocent people along the way. And so God declares that even the stones and the beams themselves of their dwelling places are going to testify against such ill-gotten gain. This woe reminds us that there is no height of power or wealth that can provide security from God's justice. Look at woe number 3. This is what I would call bloodshed and city building by violence. So starting in verse 12, God says, "Woe to him who builds a town with blood and founds a city on iniquity. Behold, is it not from the Lord of hosts that peoples labor merely for fire and nations weary themselves for nothing?" And so now God is condemning those who build civilizations through violence and injustice. The oppressive and shameful and violent acts that are done in the name of building one's own empire. Nebuchadnezzar was a great builder. And yet all of Babylon's magnificent palaces and its costly temples and its grand processional walkway down the center of town, which aroused awe and wonder to every visitor to that place, did not impress the Lord Jehovah. He only saw the blood of untold numbers of people who were slaughtered in ruthless warfare in order to obtain the means for such opulence. He saw only the perversity and the crookedness of the leaders of such a violent effort. Look at verse 15 for woe number 4. We call this debauchery and humiliating the vulnerable. God says, "Woe to him who makes his neighbors drink. You pour out your wrath and make them drunk. In order to gaze at their nakedness, you will have your fill of shame instead of glory. Drink yourself and show your uncircumcision. The cup in the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and utter shame will come upon your glory. The violence done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, as will the destruction of the beasts that terrified them. For the blood of man and the violence to the earth, to cities and all who dwell in them." So God calls out now those who exploit others' vulnerabilities for their own gratification. We have this image of making their neighbors drunk to take advantage of them. And it represents all forms of like predatory behavior, sexual predatory, economic, even relational exploitation. And we get this picture of like irresponsible leaders who, while others are suffering under their bad leadership, that they're partying and wasting their wealth on sex and booze. And God promises that those who partake in such debauchery and use their power to degrade other people will themselves be covered with shame. They will force their own destruction. Isn't this cheery? Finally, here's the 5th woe. It's woe number 5, trusting in idols. We looked at it earlier, but look again at verse 18. What profit is an idol when its maker has shaped it? A metal image, a teacher of lies. For its maker trusts in his own creation when he makes speechless idols. Woe to him who says to a wooden thing, awake, to a silent stone, arise. Can this teach? Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and there is no breath at all in it. Now, I mentioned this earlier because I think it's part of the larger framework of this text, but now God is turning his attention to this idolatry in all its forms. Whether literal idol worship, in this case made of metal and wood, or the modern idols of money and power and pleasure and success. God's mockery reaches a crescendo here as this woe exposes the fundamental absurdity of trusting in anything that we create or control rather than trusting in the living God. God says, can the metal speak? Awake the silent stone. Can it teach? No. Idols can't speak. They can't guide. They can't save. They're lifeless substitutes for the one true God who is very much alive and well and active in his world. Now, I want to bring us back to what we're talking about. It's easy to get lost in the details here. We're talking about how to posture your mind and heart when you're facing evil times. This whole section we've been talking about is to help us to clarify the mind, clarity for the mind. Evil is unleashed through pride and idolatry. So we have to think rightly about what we're dealing with. The temptation toward these sins is everywhere in our society, but it's also present in our own hearts, in our own lives. And so we have to get our minds right. But we also have to deal with our hearts. This isn't just an intellectual exercise. Because as these things are happening, we're still feeling the hopelessness of being surrounded by evil. And so we need to know how to direct our hearts to the proper source of consolation in these times. Many people turn to their own sources of comfort or escape. They turn to substances, or they turn to alcohol, or they turn to hookups, using someone else to make them feel better. They turn to doom scrolling or seeking acceptance anywhere that they can find it to numb the pain. But all these so-called comforts are birthed out of the very woes that God just told us are the source of the problem. But embedded in God's response in today's passage, I believe he also addresses our hearts. Let's call it the anchor for the heart. God is still sovereign over every evil. So in case you're like totally depressed right now, this is heavy stuff, that there are these two wonderful verses in the midst of all of this evil that I skipped over in our first reading because I was saving them for the end. They are like flashes of bright light in the darkness of this section of scripture. They are stunning and they are sharp and they are surprising. And the first one comes in verse 14. Like you're reading along and all this, the human tyrants are building cities through violence and arrogant leaders are oppressing the marginalized. And then we get to verse 14 and it says, the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Like, whoa. What a reminder out of the blue. God's glory will one day fill the earth like the oceans. This is perhaps the most hopeful verse in all of the book of Habakkuk. It reminds us that no matter how dominant evil may seem, God's glory and his justice will ultimately prevail over every human kingdom built on oppression. The Babylonians were hungry for glory. They were trying to get honor. We are often hungry for glory. And the only glory that can truly satisfy your heart is the beauty of God and the honor of God and the applause of God and the love of God and the goodness of God, the grace of God, the kindness of God, the holiness of God, the justice of God, the faithfulness of God. We need God's glory. We need God's presence. And verse 14 of Habakkuk chapter 2 tells us that one day you will bathe in it, you will wear it, you will breathe it in and out. It will wash over you like the waters of the ocean. And we say, well, how can that be? How can we have access to that kind of glory, the glory of God? Well, Philippians 2 says that Jesus Christ came to earth, that God in the flesh emptied himself of his glory. And then he went to the cross. And then he took the shame and guilt that you and I and the Babylonian empires, by the way, deserved, so that when you surrender your life to Jesus Christ, the Father clothes you, listen to this, clothes you in the honor that Jesus deserved. You see, we seek our own honor and therefore we deserve shame. But Jesus Christ, who possessed all the honor, took upon himself our shame so that we could have his honor in return. This is the beautiful exchange. That's verse 14. The second bright shining light in this chapter comes as God's exclamation point at the end of the woes in verse 20. After 5 woes pronouncing judgment on human evil, the chapter ends with this stunning contrast in verse 20. The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. Now listen, this isn't just a call to reverent worship. It's a declaration of God's ultimate authority over all earthly powers. No matter how bad things are, God is in control. He is sovereign. He has not gone. He hasn't left the scene. He hasn't stepped away from the control room. He is in charge. And no matter how chaotic everything is, he says, I'm still on my throne. Let me sum up the message of verse 20 this way. Divine justice is coming, just not yet. See, the passage ends with God in his temple, from which he governs the universe. And while human rulers may seem powerful and their injustices may appear to go unchecked, the eternal God sits on his throne, fully aware of every evil act and completely committed to ultimate justice. See, the call for the earth to be silent isn't about suppressing speech, but about recognizing that there is only one voice that matters above all others. This picture of God on his throne, it provides the theological foundation for everything that has just come before. That these woes aren't just moral pronouncements, they're declarations from the sovereign judge of the universe who has the power and authority to make good on every promise of justice. And so when we feel overwhelmed by the evil in our world, we need to remember that the Lord is still in his holy temple. He is still sovereign. He is still committed to making all things right. Here's today's big idea. God's justice may be delayed, but it is never denied. And this is frustrating, isn't it? Because we don't want it to be delayed. We want it now. We see injustice and we want to rush over to God's throne. And we want to sit in it ourselves. We want to pronounce judgments. We want to levy punishments. We want to strike people down. And nothing seems to be happening to these terrible people. There's no paybacks for all of this evil. And that must mean that God isn't currently occupying his throne. And so by golly, I'm going to go sit in it myself. And you and I will take the throne because we think we know what all those people deserve. And it's going to take something very powerful to keep you and I from the impulse to run over and sit in God's throne. And verse 20 is that powerful reminder. The throne is too big for you. And by the way, the throne is already occupied. Only he has the appropriate knowledge. Only he has the appropriate perspective, the appropriate steady hand to sit on that throne. You and I don't have any of those things. We would be terrible judges. Oh, and by the way, a bit of other bad news. The main reason you and I don't have a claim to that throne, where we would go to sit and judge others, is because we too are worthy of judgment. And as much as we hate to admit it, we long for others to be judged harshly and for justice to come to them for all the evil that they have done. But we'd really prefer mercy for ourselves. That's not fair. And you're right. And thank God it's not fair, because if it was, we would all be damned to hell. And our great comfort is to know that the God of justice, the God of mercy, is still on his throne. See, it levels the field for all of us, and it allows us to participate in the work that God is now doing toward the restoration of all things. He's on his throne because it's too big for us. C.S. Lewis once made this incredible observation. He said, when we have desires that nothing in this world can fully satisfy, rather than concluding that we need to either, turn off our minds or turn off our hearts, that the Christian conclusion must be that we were made for another world. That the longings that we feel, the ache for something more, the sense that this evil should be made right. All of these desires are pointing to something beyond themselves. They are signposts pointing us to the truth that our earthly longings were never meant to finally satisfy us. But those longings are there just to awaken in us a hunger for the world that we were actually made for. And that reality shifts how we face evil and how we face suffering now, because we're not trying to find ultimate satisfaction in a world that was never meant to give it. We're pilgrims passing through. And knowing that gives us both clarity for our minds and an anchor for our hearts. It allows us to put our ultimate trust in a God on his throne who is making all things new. I love you guys.